At my wedding, everything looked exactly the way people expect it to look. Warm lighting, crystal glasses catching the glow, and a room full of smiling faces, all acting like they were witnessing something flawless. Felt staged, almost too perfect. I was standing near the bar, adjusting my veil, when something caught my attention in the reflection of a polished metal serving tray behind me. It was my father-in-law's hand. He wasn't looking at me. He was focused on my drink. I watched as he slipped something into my glass, small, clear, and fast, like it was second nature to him. Like he'd done it before. I didn't gasp. I didn't shout. I didn't let panic ruin my own wedding day. Instead, I waited until he turned away. Then, without drawing attention, I calmly reached out and switched our glasses. Across the room, he lifted the champagne flute that was meant for me and met my eyes. His smile was relaxed, confident, almost entertained, like he already believed the night belonged to him. When he stood to make a toast, I smiled back. Because in that moment I understood something clearly. The celebration everyone expected was over. The real drama was just getting started. My name is Grace. And until that night, I honestly thought the toughest part of my wedding would be surviving the speeches. The reception took place at a lakeside estate just outside the city. The kind of place that smells like old money and tradition. Everything had been chosen by Evan's parents. Every flower, every chair, every carefully planned detail quietly reminded me that this was their world, and I was only being allowed into it on their terms. Evan squeezed my hand as we were announced as husband and wife. His smile was genuine and unguarded. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He still believed love could smooth over history and erase old power struggles. His mother, Diane, hugged me first. The embrace was careful, controlled, like she was worried I might crease her dress. "You look lovely, Grace," she said, already pulling away. Then his father stepped forward. Richard Caldwell never rushed. He was tall and composed, silver-haired, carrying the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of being obeyed. When he kissed my cheek, his voice stayed low and pleasant. "Welcome to the family." Most people would have heard warmth in that sentence. I heard ownership. Richard was a prominent attorney, well-known, well-connected, and deeply respected. People automatically deferred to him. Waiters straightened when he spoke. Guests laughed just a little too hard at his jokes. Even Evan, brilliant, kind, thoughtful Evan, still unconsciously sought his approval. I had noticed it long before the wedding. The subtle corrections. The pointed questions about my background. The way Richard liked to remind me that the Caldwells handled their problems privately. 6 months earlier, he had invited me to lunch. Just me and him. No Evan. No Diane. A quiet table in an expensive restaurant. He smiled politely and said, "Grace, you seem intelligent. So let me be clear. This family survives because we control the narrative." At the time, I didn't fully understand how far he was willing to go to keep that control. Standing in the reception hall now with champagne bubbling nearby, I finally did. 6 months before the wedding, Richard asked me to meet him for lunch, saying he wanted to clear the air. I told Evan about it, and he laughed, rolling his eyes like his father was just being dramatic again. "He probably just wants to give you the family speech," Evan said. "Don't worry." So I didn't. The restaurant was quiet and expensive, the kind where the staff knows when not to interrupt. Richard arrived early. He was already seated, already in control. When I sat down, he didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the wedding. Instead, he asked, "Do you understand how fragile reputations are?" I blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." He folded his napkin carefully, like he was repeating a lesson he'd taught many times before. "People like us don't survive scandals," he said. "We prevent them." Then he slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check. $50,000. My breath caught. "What is this?" "A solution," he said calmly. "You walk away quietly. No drama. No embarrassment. Evan will be upset, but he'll recover. He always does." I pushed the envelope back toward him. My hands were steady, even though my heart was racing. "I love your son." Richard smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "Love doesn't protect you in this family, Grace. Silence does." I stood up, my legs shaking as I reached for my bag. "I'm not leaving." He watched me the way a man watches a door close on a problem he hasn't finished dealing with. As I walked away, he spoke softly. Then don't say I didn't warn you. At the time, I assumed he meant pressure, gossip, maybe emotional manipulation. I didn't realize he meant escalation. And I definitely didn't know that warning would come true. Back at the wedding reception, I took my seat beside Evan, wearing a smile practiced enough to fool the room. My heart was steady now, but not calm. There's a difference. Calm comes from ignorance. Steady comes from readiness. Evan leaned in, his voice warm. You okay? You look pale. I'm fine, I said, squeezing his hand. Just overwhelmed. That part wasn't a lie. I was overwhelmed by how normal everything still looked. Laughter floated between tables. Glasses clinked. Someone's aunt was already crying during the first dance. No one noticed that 10 feet away, my father-in-law was holding a glass that had never been meant for him. Richard sat across from us, relaxed and confident. He lifted the champagne flute slightly, watching the bubbles rise like he was admiring his own reflection. When his eyes met mine, his expression tightened for just a moment. He sensed something was wrong. Then he stood. The room responded instantly. Conversations faded. Chairs turned. Richard Caldwell didn't ask for attention. He expected it, and people gave it without question. He cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. Thank you for being here to celebrate Evan and Grace. Hearing my name from him felt strange. This day, he continued, is about family, about trust, about knowing that the people closest to you truly have your best interests at heart. A few guests nodded. Someone chuckled softly. Evan smiled, proud and unsuspecting. He still didn't see it. He still believed this was just a speech. Richard raised the glass higher, the glass I had switched. I felt the room hold its breath. To new beginnings, Richard said. He tipped the glass back and drank. I watched him swallow. Once. Twice. He lowered the flute and smiled like a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. I lifted my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, never once looking away from him. For a brief moment, nothing seemed different. Then his smile twitched, just barely, and I knew right then the night had slipped out of his hands. At first, Richard only shifted in his chair. It was subtle, the kind of movement most people would miss. He adjusted his cufflinks, then tugged at his tie, like the room had suddenly become too warm. Diane leaned toward him and whispered something under her breath. He waved her off with a tight, forced smile. I counted quietly in my head. Not seconds yet, patterns. Richard was a man obsessed with control. He controlled rooms with his voice, meetings with his presence, and people with their fear of disappointing him. So when his body started to turn against him, he didn't panic. He tried to manage it. He cleared his throat once. Then again. The second time was sharper, more urgent. A few guests glanced in his direction, curiosity flashing across their faces. Richard noticed immediately and straightened, forcing out a laugh. Excuse me, he said, standing up a little too quickly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Evan turned toward him. Dad. I'm fine, Richard said, but his voice sounded strained, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. He took one step away from the table, then another. His hand shot out, gripping the back of a nearby chair as if to steady himself. That movement drew more attention. Conversations stalled. The music felt suddenly too loud, then too quiet. Diane stood up abruptly. Richard, sit down. He didn't. His breathing had changed, short, uneven. Not dramatic. Not violent. Just wrong. The confidence in his posture cracked, and for the first time since I'd known him, Richard Caldwell looked unsure. Someone nearby raised a phone. What's happening? Madison whispered. Evan stood fully now, concern written all over his face. Dad, do you need help? Richard's eyes flicked to me. In that instant, recognition flared into realization. He knew. His jaw tightened, and for one dangerous second I thought he might say something, accuse me, expose everything right there in front of everyone. But the room was watching. And Richard had built his entire life around avoiding scenes he couldn't control. So he swallowed it, literally and figuratively. Just give me a moment, he muttered. His legs betrayed him anyway. He stumbled, catching himself on the table. Glasses rattled. A collective gasp swept through the room. That was when the illusion finally shattered. This wasn't a man stepping out for air. This was a man losing control in public. People rushed toward him. I stayed exactly where I was, calm still, watching the consequences of a decision he had made long before tonight. Because whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just my wedding. This was the beginning of the truth surfacing. The staff moved fast. Polite smiles vanished, replaced by professional urgency. Someone called for medical assistance. Someone else turned the music down. The room buzzed with confused concern, the kind that feeds on uncertainty. Richard was guided toward a side lounge near the reception hall, Diane clinging to his arm like she could physically hold his authority together. Evan followed instinctively, his surgeon's calm trying to override his son's panic. That's when I stood up. Not rushed, not shaking, just deliberate. While everyone focused on Richard's uneven breathing and Diane's dramatic worry, something small and quiet happened. Something no one else noticed. As Richard collapsed onto the couch, his jacket shifted. From the inside pocket, a folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper slipped free and drifted to the floor near his polished shoes. I bent down and picked it up before anyone else could. The paper felt expensive, embossed, formal. My stomach tightened. This wasn't an accident. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't notes for a toast. It wasn't a medical list. It was a speech, typed, edited, polished, and prepared in advance. Ladies and gentlemen, I must apologize for the disruption. Grace has been under significant stress leading up to the wedding. Unfortunately, alcohol can trigger episodes. We are deeply concerned and will make sure she gets the help she needs. My hands went cold. He hadn't just planned to make me sick. He had planned to rewrite who I was in front of everyone I loved. To turn concern into suspicion. To turn my wedding into a warning about me. Grace. Evan's voice snapped me back. His eyes searched my face, already sensing the shift. What is that? Read it, I said quietly, holding the paper out. He took it and scanned the words once. Then again. I watched something inside him break. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. That's not possible, Evan said, his voice hollow. Richard looked up sharply. Evan, give me that. Evan stepped back. Dad, he said slowly. Why did you have this prepared? Richard swallowed, his composure unraveling further. You don't understand. I was trying to protect you. By humiliating my wife? Evan shot back. Diane jumped in, her voice sharp. Grace, this is not the time. I cut her off, my tone still calm. Then when would be a better time? Before or after I was blamed for something your husband planned? The room went silent. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, burning with a mix of fury and fear. And in that moment, I realized something deeply unsettling. He never expected to hide this paper because he never expected to be caught. What Richard hadn't planned for, what men like him never planned for, was evidence. And I wasn't finished yet. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their calm efficiency slicing through the tension. Richard was seated, questions asked, vitals checked. Diane hovered, answering for him whenever she could, her voice too loud, too insistent. Evan didn't take his eyes off his father. Neither did I. As the paramedics worked, my phone vibrated in my hand. A reply. The venue manager. Earlier, quietly and carefully, I had requested the security footage from the bar area. I knew the cameras were there. High-end venues always have them. Discretion costs money, but evidence costs less. I opened the file. There he was. Richard glancing over his shoulder. Richard reaching into his pocket. Richard tipping something into my glass. Clear. Undeniable. Time-stamped. I stepped closer to Evan and turned the screen so he could see it. He watched the footage without blinking. When it ended, he didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the paramedic. My father didn't have a medical episode, Evan said, his voice calm and unfamiliar. He ingested something that wasn't meant for him. Diane snapped toward him. Evan, stop this. You're exhausted. You're confused. I'm not, he said evenly. The lead paramedic frowned. Sir, we'll need to notify the authorities. Yes, Evan replied without hesitation. Please do. Diane grabbed his arm. You can't do this. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family? Evan gently pulled free. I know what it almost did to my wife. By the time the police arrived, the reception was officially over. Guests were escorted out quietly, their whispers trailing behind them like shadows. My parents stayed close to me, shaken but proud. My mother's hand rested firmly against my back, steady and grounding. An officer introduced himself and asked me to explain what had happened. So I did. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't cry. I told the truth the way I'd learned to tell it at work. Clearly, in order, supported by facts. The switched glasses. The prepared speech. The security footage. The officer nodded as he took notes. Ma'am, based on what you've described, we can file an immediate report and request protective measures. I looked at Evan. He nodded once. Yes, I said. I want everything documented. Diane let out a sound that landed somewhere between disbelief and rage. Grace, you're destroying us. I met her gaze, my voice quiet but steady. No. I'm protecting myself. As Richard was escorted away for further questioning, he finally looked at me. Not with confidence. Not with superiority. But with disbelief, like he still couldn't understand how a woman like me had turned his private plan into a public record. That's when something clicked. Power only works in silence. The moment the truth is written down, time-stamped, and witnessed, it stops belonging to the person who tried to control it. The police station smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The kind of place where emotions don't echo, they settle. I sat beside Evan on a hard plastic chair, my wedding dress bunched awkwardly around me. A reminder that this day had split itself cleanly in two. Across the room, Diane paced. She checked her phone over and over, making calls that went unanswered. Every few minutes, she looked at Evan like she expected him to step in and fix this, the way he always had. Richard was in another room. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the absence of his control like a vacuum. An officer approached with paperwork. Mr. Caldwell, he said to Evan, we'll need to know if you're willing to make a statement. I am, Evan said immediately. Diane spun around. Evan, you don't have to do this. He's your father. Evan stood slowly. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice, but it carried. I know exactly who he is. That's why I'm doing this. She stared at him like he'd betrayed something sacred. After everything we've given you. He shook his head. Love isn't something you trade for silence. Then he turned to me. His eyes softened, but his resolve stayed firm. I should have protected you sooner. I won't make that mistake again. The officer nodded and handed him a pen. Evan signed the statement without looking back. Later, when Richard was escorted past us, he tried one last time. He leaned toward Evan and spoke quietly. You're choosing her over your blood. Evan met his gaze. No. I'm choosing what's right. Richard had nothing to say to that. When the door closed behind him, I felt the weight lift. Not because justice was finished, but because the truth had finally been chosen out loud. That night, I understood something that stayed with me. Love isn't proven by loyalty to the past. It's proven by the courage to draw a line and refuse to cross it again. We never went back to the reception hall. We didn't cut the cake. We didn't finish the dances or the speeches that had been planned for months. The night ended quietly, not with music but with paperwork, signatures, and a long drive home in borrowed clothes. In the weeks that followed, the story tried to soften itself. Whispered explanations, convenient excuses, suggestions that stress had caused everything. But facts don't bend. The footage existed. The statements existed. The truth had already been written down. Evan and I moved into a small house on the other side of town. It wasn't impressive. It didn't come with history or expectations. What it gave us was space to breathe. One night, sitting on the floor with takeout cartons between us, Evan said, I used to think marriage was about blending families. I shook my head gently. Sometimes it's about choosing which ones don't get access to you. He nodded, understanding settling in his eyes. That was the real gift that came from everything. Not revenge, not victory, but clarity. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's responsible. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It only shields the person holding the power. So if this story leaves anything behind, let it be this. Love should never require you to swallow danger. Boundaries are not betrayal. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them, document it, and choose yourself anyway. Our wedding didn't end the way I imagined, but our marriage began exactly the way it needed to.